Good morning, everyone. So happy to have you with us this morning. Good morning, all. Welcome. Glad that you could join us this morning. We're going to give folks just a few more seconds here as they log in before we get started. Good morning, everyone. We are going to give folks just another second here to log in before we get going this morning. Glad that you could join us. All right, let's go ahead and dive in here. Welcome, everyone, to the fifth module in our six-part webinar series on adapting and adopting high-quality instructional materials. We are excited to dive in today on science and K-5 social studies. And before we do, just a quick reminder that a recording of today's webinar will be available on the Strong Start page on TEA's website, and you should see a link right now in the chat for exactly where you can find the materials from previous webinars, and this is where you'll have the materials for today's webinar will be posted towards the end of the day today. We're also going to ask that you use the Q&A feature throughout our webinar this morning to ask any questions that you might have so we can be sure that they are answered during the appropriate time. And for those of you who have been at our previous webinars, many of these faces on the screen might look familiar. For those of you who are just joining us today for the first time, my name is Kelsey Hendricks, and I'm the Senior Director of Custom Services at Instruction Partners. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Jessica Henderson, our Science Guru and Director of Science, and Jabari Sims, the Executive Director for our District Partnerships. And as each of you know, our current reality is one that is truly unprecedented. As a result, we're tasked with really reimagining how we can leverage high quality instructional materials. We also know that your teams and leaders will have to be nimble and ready to adjust instruction at a moment's notice across remote and in-person learning scenarios this fall. And as a result of that current reality, teachers across Texas are asking two main questions. One, how do I make sure all of my students experience high quality, TEKS-aligned instruction, regardless of their learning environment or level of connectivity? And two, how do I accomplish that task without seeing some or all of my students in person every day? And our series of 6 modules seeks to share with systems how they might support teachers in answering those questions. This is our 5th module today, with our prior webinars focused on determining whether to adapt materials or adopt them, and then sharing more about how specifically to do that for pre-K, for math, and for RLA. Again, you can find the recordings of each of the prior webinars, modules 1 through 4, on the Strong Start website. With the link, you should be able to see the link in the chat. Today we'll be focused on considerations for adoption and adaptation for science and K-5 social studies. We'll work on prioritizing considerations for curriculum adaptation and engage in a case study around adapting materials for remote instruction. We also want to name that we will not typically be talking about adopting or even adapting your curriculum at the beginning of August. However, we know that we're having this conversation because of COVID and the need to really have instruction that can be that can happen both remotely and in person. And I also want to note that the beginning portion of our webinar will not be focused specifically on THL 3.0, Texas Home Learning. After we go through the key considerations for adopting and adapting high quality instructional materials in science and social studies, TEA will be able to provide an overview regarding Texas Home Learning 3.0, and then we'll hold specific time for Texas Home Learning questions at the very end. Again, you'll be able to access the recording from this session along with all the other modules on the Strong Start resources page that I believe we just reposted that link into the chat. And I wanted to start our morning grounded in the experience of a 5th grade science student. So take a minute to imagine that you are this 5th grade science student. This graph that you see on the screen shows the changes in elk population in Yellowstone National Park over time. I want you to think about what might students need to understand to explain how this happens. What science ideas might they need to understand? Feel free to jump on your own ideas. So let's look at some of those key science ideas that they might need to understand. The first, organisms can survive only in environments in which their particular needs are met. Organisms and populations of organisms are dependent on their environment interactions, both with each other, with other living things and with non-living factors. And finally, newly introduced species can damage the balance of an ecosystem. In science, we want students to be able to use their science knowledge to explain what happens in the natural world. As we continue through this session, we'll consider the questions of how to continue to prioritize components of science instruction that support this ability, and how to adapt materials to a distance learning environment without losing the essential elements of science instruction. And to support us in answering those questions, let's consider what we know about the structure of science. We want students to engage in scientific processes such as formulating questions, observation, investigation, analysis of data, and modeling to derive evidence and understanding of science ideas, while they reason with evidence through the lens of interdisciplinary themes such as change and consistency, patterns, cycles, systems, and scale. If this occurs, students will be able to achieve the goal of science, which is ultimately to construct evidence-based explanations for events that happen in nature. We can also note that science is not any of these 3 areas in isolation. Science, therefore, is not a set of separate disciplines, of labs that are disconnected from natural events, or of discrete facts and theories. And based on this structure, we're going to be considering the following when planning to adapt or adopt high-quality instructional materials in science. We'll first discuss prioritizing certain components of instruction to evaluate science materials considered for adoption, then discuss how we might plan for unfinished learning in various instructional settings when adapting materials, ensuring that instructional quality, coherence, and continuity is present, knowing that we seek for all of these things to be true for our students this fall. And I'm going to transition it over now to my colleague Jabari, who will share more about how the structure of science impacts the key considerations for adopting high quality instructional materials.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, and good morning to everyone out there. I hope that you're doing well. If we can advance to the next slide, we're really going to start talking about, just like we did in our first one, our first module, we discussed how important it is that we ground ourselves in a common definition of high quality instructional materials. And that's really going to be key. Here is going to be a helpful checklist that you can use to evaluate your current curriculum and also meet the needs for remote learning. Those items are first going to include, we want to make sure that it is TEKS aligned content. Next, we also want to make sure that there's support for all learners, including students with disabilities and emerging bilingual students. Third, we want to make sure that there's support for content connections, built-in progress monitoring, And fifth, support for educators, including support for unfinished learning. These 5 components are really at the heart of all the high quality instructional materials, regardless of the context. And to really maximize student learning with our current context, the materials must also include usability both on campus and in a virtual remote setting, and also usability and additional supports for families. A high quality curriculum addresses all of these requirements, and those last 2 are really the most critical right now. So if in module 1 you were asked, can you adapt, or should you adopt? Let's take a look at the key considerations for adoption. For science specifically, science leaders will need to ask the following questions to determine the quality of science materials should they decide that they need to adopt. First, asking, are the materials aligned to grade level science TEKS? Next, determining the use of investigation to derive content and ensuring the materials support students in gaining science knowledge through formulating questions, observation, analysis of data, and modeling. The next consideration is related to explanation of phenomena. Are the materials requiring students to leverage evidence to construct explanations for events that happen in nature? And lastly, support for all learners. The material should have built-in supports to ensure all learners can access grade level content across multiple formats. So if we combine both that checklist for high quality materials with the key considerations that was just mentioned, here are the key understandings for high quality instructional materials for science. Take a few moments to review these important items. So here are the suggested actions for adoption. While all of the actions that you see here might be taken in a normal school year as you work towards adoption, those 3 actions that are in orange are the highest priority to move on quickly. And we'll discuss even more about this in our last module, module 6, where we'll be doing a deeper dive in curriculum adoption. So that was adoption, and now I'll hand it over to my colleague Jessica to discuss adapting for instructional quality, coherence, and continuity in science.
Thanks, Jabari, and good morning, everyone. So once you have high quality instructional materials, the unique circumstances of this year will still require reflection on adaptations that are specific to science. We can't fail to recognize that the upcoming school year will require you as district and school leaders to constantly make swift decisions that provide the best solutions possible to a myriad of ever-changing circumstances. From mitigating the impact of sudden school closures, both past and future, to planning for remote settings, we know that decisions have to be made quickly and efficiently. As such, we've prioritized 2 considerations to bring to the forefront when considering how to adapt high-quality science materials in this condensed timeline. The framework here outlines these 2 areas and the focus questions we hope to help you consider by engaging in a case study of a district who took these considerations into account as they adapted their materials. First, how will we address unfinished learning due to COVID-related closures at the end of the school year? And second, how do we ensure that we are engaging students in scientific investigation and reasoning in a remote environment? So let's look at how this framework plays out in District A in Texas. District A is a mid-sized urban district that adopted high-quality instructional materials in K-8 science last year. They have decided to adapt their materials this year and are most concerned about adapting for anticipated rolling closures, learning loss, and alternatives for hands-on science experiences. This case study will use specific examples from a 5th grade instructional unit in the Texas district, as well because all of the decisions you make will also be grounded in the context of materials you use locally. Our goal with this case study is to use this specific example to provide insights into the thinking process and considerations your district might use as you complete a similar process for adapting your materials. Before walking through this model, I do want to name upfront that you are the people making the difficult decisions. While we are not the individuals who answer these challenging questions at a system level, we do work in close partnership with many districts such as yours. So as I narrate through this decision-making process, I want you to imagine I am your district's science curriculum director. Let's first look at how District A might make adaptations to address unfinished learning. This requires action steps in 2 phases. First, determine progression of science ideas that support student understanding of grade level content. And secondly, incorporate tasks within units to address any identified gaps in understanding. So what does that look like in action? Let's look at how I would analyze and make decisions based on the grade level TEKS addressed in a given unit. As the science advisor for the district, I'm looking at a unit related to the ideas in our science question about a pattern we noticed happening in Yellowstone from the beginning of our session. In this unit, students engage with 5.9a and 5.9b. The question we are asking in this phase is what prerequisite science ideas need to be incorporated in order for students to access grade level instruction. According to the vertical alignment document, both of the 5th grade TEKS have 4th grade TEKS that serve as prerequisite learning. After looking at the district's scope and sequence for last year, I saw that both of these 4th grade TEKS were scheduled to be taught in the 4th quarter. Since I now know that it is likely students experience some disruption during this time, I want to ask the question of whether these ideas in these standards are needed in order to access the grade level TEKS. 4.9a includes the idea that producers need sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make their own food, while consumers depend on other organisms for food. This science idea is necessary to gain understanding of organism interaction within an ecosystem, because to understand the impacts of these interactions, students need to first know what organisms rely on to survive. Therefore, I will need to address this idea in context of the grade level TEKS as I plan for instruction. On the other hand, 4.9b is so similar to the subsequent 5th grade TEKS that traditional instruction of grade level content will cover the science ideas needed here without modification. Now, in the second phase of addressing unfinished learning, as the science curriculum director, I would ask, what tasks can be incorporated into the unit as just-in-time support to address this missed idea from 4.9a? The key is to select tasks that can be added to a unit of instruction provided by your high-quality instructional materials to provide access to gaps in learning without losing coherence. Take a moment to look over this example of an instructional sequence designed to address TEKS 5.9a. how might we insert just-in-time support into this set of tasks to introduce the prerequisite fourth grade science ideas that allow for students to access the grade level content? In lesson 1, students are making observations of a local playground or park to construct initial explanations of interactions between non-living and living things. It is important for them to understand that some living things are consumers, such as birds, and rely directly on other living things for food, while some are producers, such as plants, and rely directly on non-living factors like sunlight and water. Adding a text that highlights this idea to start this lesson, and then having students cater their observations of the local playground to include identifying examples of producers and consumers, supports the prerequisite TEKS from fourth grade. Students are then ready to move to lesson 2, which provides them with cards that share the specific diets of organisms within Yellowstone's ecosystem. Now that students understand what different organisms rely on for food, they are ready to build models by creating food webs with their cards. To continue to support student understanding of the dependent nature of organisms within an ecosystem, teachers can add to this task by removing a card from a student's completed web and asking them to explain how the loss of that organism might impact the population of another consumer. This will both ensure students are aware that other organisms depend on this organism for food, and prep students for the more specific conversation about the different patterns of interactions, such as predator-prey and competition, that demonstrate this dependency in lesson 3. As you can see, though we identified unfinished learning for our 5th graders, we did not delay grade level content to explicitly teach 4th grade units first. By adding just-in-time supports to lesson 1 and 2 of this instructional sequence, we were able to both address the unfinished learning from 4th grade and do it in a way that supports building deep conceptual knowledge of grade level content, because the integration of ideas contributes to the coherence of the unit. The second consideration in adapting high-quality instructional materials for science, I would consider as the district science curriculum director, is how to maintain that defining characteristic of science class, inquiry learning through engagement in scientific investigation and reasoning across a remote learning environment. This involves progressing through 3 phases. First, inventory science investigations within each curriculum unit. Secondly, identify suitable substitutions for hands-on learning in classrooms if needed. And finally, integrate interactive tools to support practice. Let's consider what this looks like in action in a unit addressing our second 5th grade life science TEKS, 5.9b. First, you would take inventory of the science investigations outlined within the unit that are critical to the mastery of the aligned TEKS. In this unit addressing 5.9b, the following critical tasks take place. Students collect data through a card game that simulates the flow of energy throughout a food web. And students draw a model describing the impact to the flow of energy within an ecosystem if a producer population dwindles. They then provide peer feedback before revising their own models. In order for students to engage in these tasks, are any substitutions needed, and what interactive tools can be leveraged in a remote learning environment? For example, the card game simulating energy flow throughout a food web definitely requires an alternate task in a remote environment. One option is to use an online simulation. There are several options for these simulations online, such as PhET interactive simulations, PBS Learning Media, SimBucket, and Gizmos, to name a few. It's important to note that when training teachers, I would suggest there should be significant consideration given to the environment students are in when engaging in these tasks. You can use the simulation together as a class in a synchronous environment, or it can be assigned to students to use asynchronously. In the case of the latter, teachers would want to provide supports such as detailed directions or a pre-recorded video guiding students through the operation of the simulation so that they are able to fully engage in the task independently. Lastly, online simulation options ensure that scientific investigation experiences at home don't require materials that are cost prohibitive and limit access for some students. On the other hand, while a task such as drawing models to illustrate flow of energy does not need a substitute, it would require interactive tools to allow for sharing, feedback, and revision that would normally happen in the classroom. Here, the teacher could allow students to draw models using whiteboards and take advantage of computer webcams for sharing, or plan for students to draw models in their own paper science notebooks and set up a virtual gallery walk using a tool such as Google Slides or Jamboard to upload and house pictures that students submit. Again, as the curriculum director, I would note that this task can be completed either synchronously or asynchronously, depending on the needs of the teacher and student. As leaders guiding the process of adapting high-quality instructional materials for quality, coherence, and continuity for your systems, these considerations allow for you to prioritize the most critical components of planning for the unique needs of science instruction and provide a clear path forward for your school system. We know having these discussions in August is not ideal for anyone. However, it is our hope that this guidance for your decision-making is helpful in providing some clarity and direction. At the core of science instruction is the opportunity to build deep conceptual knowledge that can help explain the world around you. And by prioritizing unfinished learning and student engagement in scientific investigation and reasoning, you are helping to ensure that opportunity is in place for all students. Next, we will see what it can look like to operationalize the adaptation process within 2 example districts in Texas. These adaptations can happen across a variety of owners in your unique local context. Take a moment to look at the action steps for adaptations and how each district assigned different voices to the steps. As noted in our considerations for adopting high-quality instructional materials for science, the opportunity to engage in scientific processes to access content should be at the core of all experiences for students. For the special circumstances that exist this year, addressing unfinished learning should not exist separately from these experiences and should be incorporated into the grade level units in a way that contributes to conceptual building of knowledge. It is also vital to consider and plan for alternate experiences and tools that allow for students to engage in cornerstones of science education, such as modeling, experimentation, and data collection in remote learning environments. Take a moment to review this flowchart, which summarizes the suggested actions for adaptation. Now I will turn the mic over to Melissa at TEA to discuss the considerations for adoption and adaptation of high quality instructional materials in K-5 social studies.
Thank you. Before I jump into social studies, I want to come back to some questions that are popping up about instructional materials versus curriculum so we can be clear on the definition. When we speak about high quality instructional materials, that really means that it is incorporating the curriculum components as well as all of the materials necessary to teach that curriculum. So when we think about that, yes, the curriculum is that scope and sequence, and more importantly, the sequence and organization of standards, and then also has all the information to guide teachers and students through the learning of those standards over the progression of the year. So just bringing up that we are really talking about high quality instructional materials incorporating the curriculum component and all of the materials and resources that support the teaching of that. I'm going to jump now into social studies. And before this starts about the structure of social studies, I want to mention that I'm going to go through some important components of what to consider with adapting social studies curriculum and finding those right instructional materials. But we will not go through a specific example because you had a strong example for science. So to begin with, the structure of social studies incorporates this engagement of critical thinking and analysis of historical documents to derive evidence and understanding of social studies ideas, incorporating those strong social studies skills in order to access the information and be able to both better understand, to internalize, and to apply. This is combined with the integration of social studies content from various disciplines, from history, geography, economics, government, citizenship, and culture as defined in our TEKS. And through that, students are able to develop and apply a depth of understanding for complex content. Move to the next slide. So the structure of social studies, not individual disciplines that are taught in isolation, a memorization of facts and dates, or just a review of valid information documents. It is instead an opportunity for students to learn historical facts and dates by engaging in critical thinking in order to better understand history and society. It is social studies disciplines that are integrated where possible to make stronger connections and understanding. And this combination of use of primary and secondary sources to develop a deeper understanding of social studies concepts through various perspectives. When we think about the social studies framework, we want to be able to prioritize components of instruction, consider and plan for unfinished learning, and consider and plan the instructional setting to ensure that instructional quality, coherence, and continuity can continue no matter the environment that students are learning. I want to take a moment to consider the key pieces of high quality instructional materials adoption specific to social studies. Returning back to what we defined as high quality instructional materials regardless of content, these are our TEKS aligned content. We're able to support all learners, support of content connections, progress monitoring, support for educators, including support for unfinished learning, and especially now, this usability both on campus and in virtual and remote settings, as well as usability and additional supports for families. This is regardless of content, but also in social studies. In Module 1, just returning to this, we asked ourselves, can I adapt my current materials based on this definition of high quality instructional materials and the needs of remote settings, or should I adopt new high-quality instructional materials to meet the needs of a remote setting? For social studies, we have some key considerations for adopting or adapting. Number one, we want to make sure that all materials are aligned to grade level social studies TEKS. Ensure that there is an incorporation of the use of inquiry and critical thinking skills to derive content. So do the materials provide students with significant opportunities to engage in inquiry and historical thinking and reasoning? Do the materials support students in gaining knowledge through developing questions and planning inquiries, analysis of a variety of primary source materials, and collecting and analyzing and interpreting data? There needs to be an opportunity for research and inquiry. Do the materials require students to use critical thinking skills and leverage research methodologies from a variety of sources? Do the materials require students to effectively use written and oral communication skills? And of course, are we able to support the needs of all learners? Are there built-in supports that ensure that all students are able to access the information and engage in the content, keeping in consideration special needs and emerging bilingual students? Can materials be leveraged across any learning format, in-person, hybrid, and/or remote learning? For social studies specifically, thinking about our key understandings, we want to go back to our high quality instructional materials for social studies, make sure that they are TEKS aligned. They include opportunities to derive social studies knowledge through critical thinking and review of historical documents. They require students to produce evidence-based explanations of historical events and the impact on society. They provide instructional supports and usability for all students and families. They support educators in addressing unfinished learning. And they allow for usability both on campus and in virtual remote settings. As we think about the suggested actions for adoption, one piece that we consider with adapting any curriculum would be about, are there connections with our reading language arts curriculum where there's a crossover in texts that are being read? And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But some suggestions for actions for adoption: we want to be able to follow the process to bring in the voices that matter to make the final decisions, but it is really important for review committees to be formed to complete the review materials, decide what to adopt, and to organize the next steps to communicate the plan. Key considerations of high quality instructional materials adapting for social studies. Pulled out some key considerations and thinking about what is different about this year. First and foremost, we need to be able to address unfinished learning. And so really being able to consider what were the prerequisite knowledge and skills that students did not master in the end of last year that are necessary to access new content, and building in just-in-time learning and supports to ensure that they are also able to engage and become proficient in grade level social studies standards. And engaging students in inquiry and critical thinking remotely. So how can we continue to engage with valid information sources and authentic inquiry experiences when students are in remote settings. So some considerations are thinking about the access to these valid information sources. Where is there a potential crossover with reading language arts texts in which students can engage that are social studies focused, but also have an opportunity for them to have access to those text materials? So how are they getting the text? And how are we setting up the experiences that typically happen in social studies classrooms around discussion and engagement with peers to think about how that occurs in the remote setting? These are not easy answers, but learning from our experiences over the spring of what worked best for bringing students together and how to take and make that learning come alive in this remote setting will be important. Considerations will have to be made about adapting the instruction materials currently used to ensure the same level of engagement, inquiry, and critical thinking can happen remotely. I'm going to turn it back over to Kelsey to go through some Q&A with all of you, and then we can talk about Texas home learning.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. At this point, if you have any questions regarding specifically adapting or adopting high quality instructional materials in science or social studies, we ask that you place those into the Q&A now before we transition it back to talk about Texas home learning. I know we've already been able to answer a couple of questions that have come in.
One question I did want to address is there was a question about why K-5 social studies. The topic that we just discussed with social studies is true regardless of grade level. And we'll talk shortly about Texas home learning, but we said K-5 because that is what will be available for possible adoption is K-5 social studies in Texas home learning 3.0 and the same K-5 science.
Seeing a couple of questions come in now about THL. We're going to wait to answer those until later, specifically after we have an additional overview of THL. But Melissa, correct that THL will only be providing K-5 social studies as an option for adoption?
K-5 science and K-5 social studies at this point. We are still continuing to explore options that could be a possible later for secondary.
Thanks.
I do want to address this question about there's really a comment about interactive tools. I think this related to science, but I would think for any content, it is really important to think about, is the interactive tool enhancing the student's experience and ability to better understand the content and apply skills? Or is it an opportunity to more surface level know the topic or even as a gaming? And that's a critical piece that needs to be considered when we place the use of those interactive simulations and tools, is how we use them with students in this remote learning setting.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, and if we go back to the case study, that's one of the key considerations, right? Of does the use of this virtual tool provide an experience for students that supports their understanding of that key critical moment in science? Melissa, it looks like there's a question that's come in about options for districts. Would you mind taking that one?
Sure, I see it, so I'm going to try to. Oh, so we are not asking districts to adopt new curriculum. What we are sharing with you is that some considerations to make as you are either enhancing or you are considering additions to add to supporting remote setting. What we are also offering is an option for districts to select the use of K-5 science or K-5 social studies as part of Texas home learning, which I'll talk about in just a second, and then maybe answer some more questions there.
Great. So let's go ahead and move there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And before we do, just a reminder that on Friday, we'll be wrapping up our webinar series by talking about implementing Texas home learning from the perspective of curriculum or high quality instructional materials implementation, and really focus on then what might that mean if I'm a district in my unique local context, about thinking about potentially adopting Texas home learning. And before we turn it back over to Melissa, we would love some of your thoughts and feedback on our portion of the webinar today focused on adopting or adapting high quality instructional materials in science and social studies. If you take a moment to either click on the link that's being chatted out to you now or use the QR code that you see on the screen, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. And again, you'll be able to find the recording of today's webinar on TEA's Strong Start page, where the link will also place the link again in the chat. And with that, Melissa, I'm going to turn it back over to you to share more about Texas home learning.
Thank you, Kelsey. So if you've been on our webinar series, this is not going to be new information, but I'll talk through it and then answer some questions. So to get started with Texas home learning on the next slide, Texas home learning is a freely accessible, optional, aligned suite of resources that educators can use fully or in part to support the new learning environment. What it provides are three main components. Curriculum, I'm going to say high quality instructional materials based on the definition we talked about earlier, which means both the curriculum, the direction of it, as well as all of the associated components to support that curriculum. So it'll be, we'll go over the content in a moment, but they are standards aligned curricula that has been customized for Texas for this current learning environment, meaning that has been specifically designed to support teachers for how to use in synchronous, asynchronous, and in-person instruction. It also includes a suite of technology tools for including a learning management system to support engagement, instructional collaboration, and progress monitoring. And the third component is this professional development, where content and technology focus professional development to support educators with implementation and use. Districts may optionally adopt none, part, or all of these three components above. We are offering free access to TEKS aligned and TPG for the pre-kindergarten, digitized resources to be facilitated by teachers that are customized for Texas. Unlike THL 1 and 2 that were really focused on families, this is intended for the teacher use, but supports with students being in various environments. We will provide math pre-K through 12th grade. We actually have a pre-K systems, so it incorporates all content areas. English language arts and reading, pre-K through 12th grade. Spanish language arts through 5th grade, science through 5th grade, and social studies through 5th grade. We also have Spanish versions of science and social studies and math up to 5th grade, 6th grade. 5th grade for science and social studies. As part of this, each grade level and subject resources is customized to Texas. It includes unit plans and daily lessons plans aligned to the Texas standards. It has built-in progress monitoring, digital format with printing capabilities, formative and summative assessments, teacher, student, and family supports, and accessibility supports for all learners. We're also happy to announce that TA was able to negotiate a statewide license for Schoology for all interested districts for 2 years. Schoology is a learning management system, and districts interested are able to go to the site on the bottom, www.powerschool.com/Texas, where you can share your interest and get ready to use Schoology immediately. Districts must begin using Schoology anytime between today and March 1st to benefit from this license. It allows for integration with existing platforms and the curriculum, the instructional resources and other products as needed. You can also select to use curriculum created by your district to incorporate in Schoology and not THL curriculum. Current Schoology customers may pause current contracts to benefit from this, and we are working to provide implementation support through TA, Schoology, and the education service centers. Districts and teachers will have access to ongoing professional development throughout this next school year. This will include remote learning and school models, instructional materials specific. So we will begin to provide webinars over each of the products so that you can deeply understand them. And we will provide some professional learning on storage, classroom, and learning management system. We are working in collaboration with the education service centers to help fully support those interested in use of THL3. Lastly, before I look at questions and begin to answer those, I would like to encourage any districts that are considering using Texas Home Learning 3.0. We're interested in learning more from you and would like to feature you in our webinar this Friday. Please contact me or directly at Texas Home Learning at tea.texas.gov if you would be interested in being a featured district during our webinar this Friday. I'm going to jump to questions that are coming in. So please enter your questions in the question section. If I'm unable to get to all of these, please, I'll try to contact you individually or post them. I'll do my best to answer them live. One question I see is there a specific scope and sequence that was being referenced in the webinar? I think that this refers to either the science component. We really were talking in general there, but with THL 3.0, if you do elect to use the curriculum, there will be a scope and sequence provided. Yes, so there's a question about what are the curricular components that are integrated into THL3. They're organized into units, and within a unit, there would be a end of unit assessment. If a unit is longer than 4 weeks, it will have a mid-unit assessment. It will include daily lesson plans, all of the support materials, teacher guidance, both in how to use the materials specifically in classrooms, in remote settings, asynchronously and synchronously. And all of the reference of some digital tools are incorporated in some of these depending on the product. All of that we are planning to share as soon as we are able to complete our final contract signing with our publishers to be used there. We'll release those soon and have specific webinars for each piece. The technology tools I was referencing here was really about the use of the LMS with Schoology, which incorporates being able to have a single sign-on or use of things such as managing pieces like Google Classroom. There are some digital tools associated with some of the THL content curricula that we'll be able to share later.
We're getting some questions about alignment to the TEKS resource system. And so we're working on additional guidance on how the two systems could be used together.
Yeah. We have a question that asks, can we see it on Friday? If we have permission at that time to release any of the content or announce any of the specific curricula, we will share that as soon as we're able to. The social study, there's some questions about the scope and sequence. That is working directly with the sequence for social studies is directly working with the publishing vendor associated with those high quality instructional materials, specifically created for Texas, in directing and working with our team at TEA to guide what that should look like for elementary social studies. You can adopt Schoology and utilize your own instructional materials and curriculum. You do not have to use the THL3 curriculum. So yes, you could incorporate your own curriculum. THL 2.0 sadly is no longer available because of the agreements with the vendors associated with those materials. We had to end THL2 on July 31st. We have a lot of the questions about the adoption that's coming up for pre-kindergarten. Your district can elect to use the THL3 materials as your pre-kindergarten materials if you decide that. It's a local decision. We will release it as soon as we possibly can. I know people are anxious. We're anxious too, and we're working hard to get it released as soon as we are able to. There's a question about the vetting of social studies. We have a lot of review and vetting of all of the materials that will be released through Texas Home Learning 3.0. We'll have opportunities for public, teacher, educator groups to come together to provide feedback, plus some political review and ensuring that we are careful about sensitive topics. So there is a lot of review that will occur, including working with the public to be able to do that. So we are working diligently to set up our feedback and put together educator groups, as well as our internal TEA staff to do review. We also have external vendors doing a comprehensive review and vetting of materials. Those are the majority of a lot of the questions that are left here. I know people are anxious, of course, to see it. We will work and hopefully on Friday be able to share a little bit more about the actual release of materials. We are almost at time. Dana, are there any other questions that?
I think there's just some additional questions on the review of the science and social studies materials. And so I think, Melissa, you touched on that a little bit, but if there's anything else you want to add about that, there's some questions on that.
Yeah, we have review within TEA. We have our content specialists. We have our special populations specialists who are working to review materials specifically. We have an external review vendors who are are reviewing all the curriculum. And then we are also putting together different stakeholder groups in order to provide feedback for continuous improvement to ensure that we are meeting the demands of the field and allowing for voices to be heard to improve the curriculum as it continues to roll out. It will not all come out in a single package. It will be rolled out over the course of the year because it is being specifically created for Texas. We do have people who are content specialists in social studies at TEA. If that person would like, who had that comment, if you'd like to email me directly, I'm happy to connect. And there is vertical alignment. All of these are aligned materials. We have engaged the public over the course of this time to ensure that they were able to help direct what THL3 would look like. So we have been in constant contact with superintendents, ESCs, and district staff in order to provide guidance in the production of Texas Home Learning 3.0. I appreciate all your questions. Please, if you have additional questions, you can contact us at Texas Home Learning at tea.texas.gov, and we are happy to respond to the additional questions. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. We appreciate all you're doing, and please reach out to us. We'll be happy to get back in touch with you. Have a wonderful day.